The ceiling fans in Municipal Courtroom 5 stirred the thick New Orleans air with lazy indifference, their blades cutting through humidity like tired hands waving off a storm no one dared acknowledge. It was barely past 8:00 a.m., but the heat had already curled itself around the city like a second skin sticky, inescapable and heavy with the scent of sweat, moss, and old secrets. The benches groaned under the weight of civilians and court officers alike. Lawyers fanned themselves with legal folders. Clerks typed with mechanical resolve, and whispered prayers and muttered curses hung suspended between dusty blinds and chipped marble. Officer Derek Slater stood at the entrance like a blockade of ego, wrapped in a uniform white. Square-jawed, thick-necked, his belt sagged with the weight of weaponry he wore like medals. He wasn't just posted at the door, he owned it in his mind. Arms crossed, lips curled into a sneer that sat just shy of contempt. He scanned the room not to protect it, but to dominate it. It wasn't protection that made Slater proud, it was the power to exclude, to remove, to remind people they didn't belong. And then he saw her. She sat in the front row, a black woman in a cream blouse and tailored black slacks. Upright, composed. Her hands were folded neatly on her lap. No phone, no pad, no visible ID, just watching eyes sharp, posture regal. No name tag, no badge. She didn't flinch under his gaze. In fact, she didn't look at him at all. That, more than anything, irritated him. That stillness, that refusal to be cowed. Derek's teeth clenched. She wasn't local. Not from his district, not from his world. He'd handled enough disruptors to know when someone was about to cause a scene. That was the lie he often told to justify what came next. And this woman with her quiet gaze and her unflinching presence, she was about to be made an example of. He moved toward her with the swagger of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. "Ma'am," he said, his voice loud enough to pierce the murmurs. "This section is for verified court personnel and city observers only." She did not reply. He reached down, grabbed her by the elbow. "You're going to need to leave this area immediately." Still, she said nothing. And that silence, that calm refusal, was gasoline to the fire inside him. "Do you think this is a damn circus?" he snapped, tightening his grip and yanking her to her feet. "Get up! Get out! Now!" The scrape of her shoes against the old tile floor echoed like chalk on a gravestone. The courtroom stilled. Even the fans seemed to pause. A pen dropped, and no one moved to retrieve it. As Derek shoved her toward the aisle, her body remained upright, her head held high, her expression unshaken. That was when the voice came, not hers, but the judge's. It cracked through the courtroom like a lightning bolt, splintering wood. "Officer Slater, stand down immediately." The command struck with such force that Derek hesitated mid-motion, his grip still on her arm, but his certainty already unraveling. The judge, a seasoned jurist named Harold Bellamy, who rarely raised his voice above polite reprimand, was now on his feet, eyes wide in horror. "You just assaulted the newly appointed chief of police," Judge Bellamy said slowly, as if each word had to be measured for the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Dr. Maya Roux." A gasp rippled through the room, followed by the kind of silence that doesn't simply fall, it descends, like ash after a fire. The defense attorney at the side table muttered, "Dear God," under his breath. A clerk's eyes welled with tears. The court reporter stopped typing. Even the prisoners awaiting hearing in the holding cage behind the glass exchanged stunned glances. Officer Slater froze. His grip slackened. Maya Roux stepped back, brushing the sleeve of her blouse where his hand had been. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her stare, calm, deliberate, and piercing, was more devastating than any reprimand. Slater's mouth moved, searching for a defense. But there was none. Because power, real power, doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't need to. And he had just manhandled it. Judge Bellamy's gavel slammed down once, twice, 3 times, each strike a funeral drum for Officer Slater's career. This proceeding is suspended until further notice. All court officers remain in place. Internal Affairs has been notified. And still, Maya said nothing. She didn't look at Slater again. She didn't turn to the cameras that had caught every second of the assault. She walked calmly, gracefully, past the council tables, past the bailiff, and out through the courtroom's heavy double doors. The light from the hallway spilled across her back like a benediction. The door clicked shut behind her with a soft thunk. But inside, it echoed like thunder. Slater stood motionless. The swagger drained from his spine. His hands trembled at his sides, not from regret, but from realization. He hadn't just grabbed the wrong woman. He'd dragged centuries of arrogance into the daylight, and the world had seen. One by one, those in the courtroom began to breathe again. But it wasn't a breath of relief. It was reckoning. In that moment, under the weight of fluorescent lights and shattered assumptions, New Orleans witnessed the collision of 2 Americas, one armored in entitlement, the other armored in quiet defiance. And as the news alerts started buzzing on phones, as tweets spread like wildfire, and camera footage began its viral march across the internet, the question that hung in the air was no longer, what just happened? It was what happens now. Because Maya Roux hadn't come back to her city for applause. She had come for truth. And Officer Derek Slater had just given her the perfect place to start. The plane descended slowly into Louis Armstrong International Airport, its wheels skimming the tarmac with a groan that seemed to echo the weight Maya Roux carried in her chest. From the small window, she could already see the sprawl of New Orleans cutting through the bayou like a stained mosaic parishes she once knew as a child, now blurred by decades of absence and a legacy of silence. 2 days before the courtroom humiliation that would capture national headlines. Maya had returned not as a prodigal daughter, but as a storm wrapped in a navy blue blazer and polished black shoes. She had come home to assume the role that no one in the department had ever thought a black woman, especially her, would hold chief of police. The badge in her briefcase bore weight, not pride. Its shine was a reflection of everything she had endured to earn it, and everything she would have to confront to carry it. As the driver escorted her toward the city, Maya looked out over the sagging rooftops, the narrow shotgun houses leaning like elders too tired to stand, and she remembered. It had been the spring of 1991. She was only 10 years old when her world fractured beneath the weight of sirens and silence. Her father, Ernest Roux, a well-known community organizer and professor, had led a peaceful protest near the edge of the French Quarter. They were marching against redlining and discriminatory policing. Families, children, preachers, no weapons, just signs and hope. She had stood with her mother on the curb, holding a placard painted with crooked letters, "Protect our streets with justice." And then it happened. She remembered the shriek of the police cruiser tires as they pulled up. The way the officers didn't even ask for names. Her father didn't fight. He raised his hands. He smiled, even. But Officer Raleigh and another man someone Maya never saw clearly took him down anyway. Knees on his back, elbows driven into pavement. A baton cracked over his ribs. And when her mother screamed, another officer whispered, "He should have stayed in his lane." They took him away like he was nothing. Maya never forgot the blood on his shirt or the stone-dry look in her mother's eyes. No charges were filed. No apology came. Her father lost tenure that year. Her mother lost her voice for months. By the time Maya was old enough to choose a path, the idea of law enforcement wasn't a career, it was a counterattack. She didn't just want to wear the badge, she wanted to make it mean something again. But ambition built on grief is never weightless. And now, as the cruiser rolled past St. Charles Avenue and into the shadow of police headquarters, the past rose up like fog off the Mississippi dense, quiet, and hard to ignore. Her brother, Damian Roux, met her outside the building. Tall, sharp-witted, and battle-worn from years as a civil rights attorney. Damian had taken a different path through the same fire. They embraced quickly, tension between their shoulders never fully dissolving. "They gave you a corner office or a cell with windows?" he asked dryly. Maya smirked. "Haven't decided which is safer yet." But beneath the sarcasm was unease. Damian knew the city, knew the department, and more than anyone, he knew the thing Maya had just walked into. "You're gonna be tested," he said bluntly as they walked past rows of officers, some who nodded, some who didn't even look up. "This place doesn't take kindly to outsiders, especially not ones who can dismantle the lies they've sworn to protect." "I'm not here to make friends," Maya replied. "Good," Damian said, "because most of them are sharpening knives behind those badges." He handed her a folder unmarked, weathered. Inside were photocopies of a sealed file she hadn't seen in 30 years. Her father's arrest report. Her hands froze. The same familiar name was scrawled at the bottom of the booking entry, Officer R. Slater. "You've got to be kidding me," she whispered. "Nope," Damian said, "your friend from court." That's not his first rodeo. He was a rookie back then, pulled the arrest. The other names blacked out higher up, but this file, it came from a whistleblower. Maya flipped through the brittle pages, line after line, redacted, and then a unit designation she hadn't heard before. DUOM 7, abbreviated for the Dominion. She looked up. "What is this?" Damian's jaw clenched. A shadow unit, Internal Elite Task Force, created in the 80s during the so-called crackdown era. Technically disbanded in 2002, but unofficially, they never left. They just changed names, swapped badges, and kept operating under the radar. Surveillance, intimidation, targeting black organizers. And now, they're in senior command. Judges, captains, chiefs of staff. Maya closed the folder slowly, heat rising in her neck. And nobody's exposed them. "People tried," Damian said. "They buried every attempt. They erased paper trails, discredited whistleblowers, tampered with internal audits. You're not just walking into a department. Maya, you're stepping into a fortress." She leaned back in her chair, trying to control her breathing. The uniform she had just put on it felt heavier now. Not just the fabric, but the history it carried. All those years chasing justice in other cities, building a reputation, writing reform policies, rising through the ranks only to return home and find out the battle was always here, waiting for her. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was her executive assistant, Marielle, who spoke softly but urgently. "Chief, we received a request this morning. Internal Affairs wants to delay your review of pending misconduct files. They say the data system needs routine maintenance." Maya raised an eyebrow. That's not coincidence. That's obstruction. She stood. Tell them to lock nothing. Pull every case that mentions the Dominion, official or otherwise. Cross-reference it with officers still active. Marielle hesitated. That's a lot. I know, Maya said. Start with the ones that were closed without disciplinary action. And just like that, the clock had started. The ghosts of the past had names, ranks, and seats of power. But now, so did she. And she wasn't just here to lead a department. She was here to break its curse. The deeper Maya Roux looked, the less she liked what stared back from the department's digital underbelly. At first, the Dominion had seemed like a bad memory, a disbanded tactical unit with a reputation for aggressive enforcement. But as she began to review sealed files, legacy access logs, and obscure personnel transfers, it became horrifyingly clear. The Dominion wasn't gone. It had simply changed skin, like a snake shedding armor. What began as a clique of hardline officers assigned to high-risk neighborhoods had mutated into a shadow network, one that not only sabotaged careers, but shaped policy, covered its own tracks, and cultivated silence like rot beneath polished floorboards. Maya worked alone at first, slipping into the records room after hours, unlocking archives tagged with outdated codes and half-scrubbed metadata. She marked patterns, internal affairs investigations that vanished mid-process, anonymous complaints resolved within 48 hours, and a trail of black officers who had either been forced into retirement, demoted after phantom infractions, or pushed out of the academy altogether. One file in particular made her pause, candidate number router 44321, Thomas Chen. The dismissal reason unfit for command temperament. No psych evaluation attached. No citation of specific incidents. Just 2 typed lines. Maya stared at the page, then picked up her office phone. Marielle, get me Officer Noelle Chen. Noelle arrived just before midnight, wearing her NOPD sweatshirt like armor, eyes wary but alert. At 27, she had the precision of someone who trusted numbers more than people. Her role as a data analyst was supposedly limited to digital forensics and court-requested data pulls. But Maya knew she had inherited her brother's hunger for justice. She gestured to the folder without a word. Noelle sat. One glance at the name, and she went still. They said he failed the impulse control module. She whispered, voice flat. But he never even got the test date. They told us it was postponed. Then 2 weeks later, his application status turned red. No appeal. No interview. Thomas was targeted. Maya said gently, and I think I know who by. Noelle's knuckles whitened as she closed the folder. From that night forward, they worked as a team unofficially, using Maya's access as chief and Noelle's technical expertise. They combed through 5 years of Dominion-related data, but it didn't stop at unjust discharges or manipulated psych assessments. The real web started in the contract databases. Look at this, Noelle said one evening, spinning her laptop toward Maya. On screen was a financial trail, faint but visible small recurring payments from the city's public safety budget to a regional contractor, Delta Shield Solutions. Originally, a minor provider for body armor and fleet vehicle maintenance. Delta Shield's invoices had ballooned over the last 2 fiscal years, $500,000 here. $2 million there for vaguely labeled services like tactical advisory and internal efficiency development. What even is efficiency development? Maya muttered. Noelle pulled up the registry of approved vendors. Delta Shield isn't just billing for supplies. They've been embedding their consultants inside NOPD as civilian advisors. They sit in on disciplinary reviews, ride along on recruitment screenings, even had a seat at last year's Academy curriculum rewrite. And at the center of their rise, one name popped up repeatedly in emails and authorization memos. Judge Harland Givens. The same Givens who oversees the Municipal Review Board, Maya asked. Same one, Noel said. He's been championing Delta Shield as a cost-saving solution for over a decade. But their founders, former Dominion officers, retired just before the unit was officially dissolved. The implications slammed into Maya like a freight train. The Dominion hadn't just survived, they'd privatized. Delta Shield had become their shell, and Judge Givens their enabler. They weren't just influencing NOPD, they were profiting from it, crafting the very policies they'd once enforced with batons and boots, now hidden behind contractor titles and judicial privilege. The revelation made Maya's breath hitch. She leaned back, staring at the ceiling like it could offer clarity. "This isn't a conspiracy," she said. "It's a business model." But with that knowledge came danger. A week after their first breakthrough, Maya noticed her office door ajar one morning despite having locked it the night before. Her files rearranged, her laptop login history cleared of timestamps. Noel received a warning notice through HR alleging misuse of privileged data, and an anonymous tipster emailed Maya a photo of herself entering the records room. Captioned, "Careful who watches the watchers." That same afternoon, a black SUV trailed Maya from headquarters to her apartment, then again to her mother's old church in the 7th Ward. No plates, no lights, just shadow. "They know we're on to them," Noel whispered as they reviewed files in the station basement. The only room with no cameras and barely functioning Wi-Fi. "I need to talk to someone outside the city," Maya said. "Someone who can blow this wide open if something happens to me." She reached out to Special Agent Arjun Desai, an old contact from the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, known for cracking corrupt police task forces in Detroit and Albuquerque. Within days, Desai arrived quietly in New Orleans under the guise of a routine assessment of departmental reform. But his questions were sharp, his timing deliberate. While Desai coordinated with Maya on formal inquiries, Noel went deeper underground, creating an encrypted database of every Dominion-connected file they'd uncovered. She labeled it Mosaic, because she explained with a grim smile once it breaks open. All the pieces will show the whole picture. The final thread came when Noel traced internal emails about Thomas Chen's dismissal to a civilian inbox tied to Delta Shield. The sender advisor, R. Slater. That's when it clicked. Slater hadn't just been a bigoted patrol cop with a short fuse. He was Dominion. He had been there since the beginning. Had filed the arrest report on Maya's father, had helped orchestrate Thomas Chen's sabotage, and now he was stationed in the very courtroom Maya had entered 2 days ago, where he assaulted her in front of dozens of witnesses. The trap hadn't been set that morning. It had been built years ago, and now Maya knew the face behind the first stone. She knew the threads tying Slater to Delta Shield, to Givens, and to the entire infection spreading through her department's bones. But knowing was only the beginning. The reckoning was coming, and this time it would not be silent. It began like any other municipal hearing in Courtroom 3B, with the slow scrape of wooden benches, the rustle of legal pads, and the hollow whisper of a worn ceiling fan slicing the thick New Orleans heat. The docket was crowded, the air was stale, and the walls seemed to sweat with the burden of too many secrets. That morning, a young black EMT named Darius Maddox, his jaw still wired from a baton fracture, one eye still swollen, was scheduled to testify against an NOPD officer accused of using necessary force during a mistaken arrest. The officer in question, Sergeant Jason Murdoch, wasn't just any patrolman. He was a known associate of the Dominion, a legacy recruit who had risen through the ranks under the protective canopy of men like Derek Slater and Judge Harland Givens. That's why Chief Maya Roux wasn't there in uniform. She wasn't flanked by a publicist or escorted by an aide. She arrived quietly, in a dark linen blouse and slacks, her hair pulled back, her presence stripped of rank, just a woman taking a seat in the front row, holding her silence like a blade. She hadn't told Noel, hadn't warned Desai. This wasn't about surveillance or strategic leverage. It was a test. She needed to see how the courtroom moved when no one thought it was being watched. She needed to feel the air change not when cameras were on, but when power thought it was safe to be cruel. And cruelty, as always, didn't need a delay. The hearing hadn't even begun when Officer Derek Slater spotted her. He stood near the courtroom's double doors like a sentinel drunk on his own authority. His fingers curled into fists, his boots spread wide, his eyes scanning every face for signs of challenge. When he saw Maya composed, unmoving, a black woman alone in the front row, he didn't blink. He didn't hesitate. To him, she wasn't the chief of police. She was just another disruption, another threat dressed in dignity, another piece of furniture to be rearranged or removed. "Ma'am," he said, voice booming through the quiet like a warning shot. "This section is for credentialed observers only. I'll need to see identification." Maya didn't respond. She sat still, her chin slightly raised, her hands folded neatly on her lap. The silence was deliberate. Slater's lip curled. "You don't get to ignore a directive." "Sweetheart, let's go." Still, she didn't move. No panic. No panic. Just calm, infuriating, quiet defiance. And then he snapped, without warning. Slater stepped forward, grabbed her by the elbow, and yanked her from her seat with the kind of force meant to humiliate, not just remove. The crowd gasped. A bailiff dropped his folder. Even the clerk paused mid-keystroke. But Slater didn't stop. He dragged Maya halfway down the aisle, his grip bruising, his voice barking like a dog unleashed. "You want to play games," he sneered. "You'll play them outside in cuffs." And that's when the gavel fell. The first strike echoed like thunder. The second, like a shot. The third, like judgment itself. "Officer Slater." Judge Harland Bellamy shouted from the bench, his voice trembling not with rage, but realization. "Release that woman." This instant, Slater hesitated, confused, stunned by the shift in tone. Bellamy stood. "You just laid hands on Chief Maya Roux, head of this city's entire police department." Gasps turned into silence. A deathly, electric silence. Slater's face drained of color. His hand opened slowly, as if his fingers had just realized who they'd touched. Maya pulled her arm away without flinching. She adjusted her sleeve, straightened her posture, then, without a single word, turned and walked back down the aisle. The courtroom parted like water. Phones had been recording. Reporters in the back had captured every second. The courtroom cameras hadn't missed a beat. And before Maya even reached the doors, the footage had already started its viral ascent, uploaded, clipped, shared, dissected. A black woman of supreme authority manhandled like a trespasser, a chief dragged like a criminal. By the time she stepped into the hallway, the world had already changed. The judge recessed the hearing immediately. Slater was escorted from the building, not arrested. Not yet, but stunned into silence. his hands shaking as he tried to offer half-hearted explanations to a wall of cameras that no longer treated him like law, no longer treated him like anything but what he was exposed. Outside the courthouse, Maya stood at the top of the stone steps, the New Orleans sky behind her churning with the promise of rain. She hadn't called a press conference, but the microphones came anyway. "Chief Roux!" one reporter shouted. "Were you targeted?" Another was this part of a larger pattern of misconduct inside NOPD. And then a third. "What message do you have for the people watching?" She paused, just a breath, then looked straight into the lens of the nearest camera. "This wasn't the first time a black body was mistaken for a threat," she said, "but it may be the last time this city lets it slide." She turned and walked away, her heels striking the concrete with a rhythm that sounded more like a declaration than a retreat. In the hours that followed, the footage exploded online. Dragged not. Defeated trended within minutes. Major news outlets replayed the moment again and again. Slater's grip, the judge's voice, the quiet rage in Maya's eyes. Civil rights groups issued statements. Veterans of the 1991 protests that had once imprisoned Maya's father began organizing a new march through the French Quarter. By sunset, City Hall was surrounded, not by rioters, but by witnesses, teachers, nurses, retired officers, firefighters, EMTs, young mothers pushing strollers, elders holding signs that read, "She earned the badge. Now protect her with it." The mayor released a tone-deaf statement about due process. Slater's union promised to fully investigate, but neither could stop the tide. Because this wasn't just about a courtroom scuffle, it was about how a system trained to dismiss, discredit, and degrade had just mistaken its own chief for a criminal, and done so live, without hesitation, in front of the very justice it claimed to serve. And the people weren't having it. By nightfall, Maya sat in her office. The lights dimmed. The building unusually quiet. Noel arrived with a folder marked Urgent. Inside was a summary of internal emails showing Dominion-affiliated officers discussing how to contain the fallout. One name reappeared like a stain, Delta Shield Solutions. Their PR firm had already begun crafting talking points, suggesting Maya had provoked the officer by refusing to identify herself. "They're going to spin it," Noel said. "Let them try," Maya replied. "Every lie they use, I'll bury with truth." Her phone buzzed. A message from Agent Desai. "We've got eyes. DOJ ready to support. Just say the word." She typed one word in reply. "Proceed." Because what happened in that courtroom wasn't just an attack. It was an opening. The Dominion thought it could silence her with spectacle. Instead, it gave her a spotlight. And Maya Roux, daughter of protest, officer of law, child of New Orleans, was about to turn that spotlight into a fire. The fluorescent lights above flickered with the low hum of hospital machinery, casting long shadows across the sterile walls of room 407. Maya Roux lay upright in a hospital bed, her arm bruised from where Slater had yanked her, her left shoulder sore from the impact against the courtroom bench, but her eyes sharp, resolute, restless, betrayed no pain. She had refused morphine, refused extended observation, refused to be treated like a victim. What she hadn't refused, however, was the Department of Justice. By the time the second IV bag began its slow drip, she had already placed the call to Special Agent Arjun Desai, giving him 3 words: It's time. Begin. Desai arrived the next morning with a 10-person federal team, each agent trained not just in auditing departmental records, but in reading the cracks between them. The NOPD, long praised for surface reforms, suddenly found itself under a forensic microscope. The mission was clear root out systemic abuse, expose structural corruption, and dismantle the insidious ghost of the Dominion. But for Desai, it was more than an assignment. It was personal. He had seen what unchecked authority could do in Detroit, in Baltimore, in Ferguson, and now, in New Orleans. The face of unchecked power wore a badge and had dragged a sitting chief through a courtroom like a sack of contraband. Back at headquarters, the walls of silence began to tremble. Officer Noel Chen, sleepless but undeterred, had already begun organizing files she'd kept off the grid duplicates of surveillance footage, message logs, and digital breadcrumbs that pointed to a chilling pattern of misconduct. One by one, she and Maya's inner circle began decoding the operational routes of the Dominion untraceable detentions, ghost case numbers, files sealed before investigation, and a second server buried under legacy archive storage, which held the most damning data of all. Noelle stared at her monitor, heart racing. These weren't just misconduct cover-ups. This was a separate justice system, an invisible one. The files were labeled with codes D-Alpha, D-Bravo, D-Gamma, and cross-referenced to internal personnel logs. Nearly every file ended the same way: action resolved via internal discretion, translation, suppression, retaliation, disappearance. Maya, still in her hospital gown, took the printouts into her lap. Each sheet was a scar, and each scar had a name EMTs falsely arrested during protest patrols. Officers forced to resign after reporting harassment. Young cadets expelled after failing loyalty assessments. And in the center of it all, Sergeant Derek Slater. He wasn't just a blunt instrument. He was a courier of punishment. A warning in uniform. Emails between him and Dominion-aligned captains confirmed orders to neutralize disruptions, discourage escalation through demonstration, and most chillingly, manage command optics. These weren't just rogue officers. They were soldiers following doctrine. By the end of the second day, Desai ordered a full administrative lockdown of the department's Internal Affairs Division. Slater was formally suspended without pay, pending multiple investigations. His locker was sealed, his access revoked. As he was escorted from the precinct, cameras captured the image of a man suddenly disconnected from the machine he once served. But the real fracture came later. One of his own turned. A mid-level training officer, Lieutenant Ramon Dalca, quietly approached Desai outside a federal review meeting and handed over a thumb drive. "I didn't sign up for this," Dalca said, not meeting Desai's eyes. "They told us it was about cleaning the force, rooting out instability." But they were the instability. The thumb drive was a revelation. Inside were recordings of Dominion planning sessions dating back 7 years. In one, a voice identified as Judge Harland Givens discusses the manipulation of detainment logs if they don't get booked. They can't sue. Simple. In another, Slater discusses suppressing witness statements during an officer-involved shooting. Can't have the kid testifying if he's got priors. Put pressure on the mother. She'll fold. Maya listened to the recordings from her recovery room. The drip still in her arm. The hum of machinery as her only companion. "This isn't a scandal," she murmured. "It's an institution." Meanwhile, the officers who had once cheered for Slater in the locker rooms began to sweat. Captain Maurice Denton, long rumored to be a Dominion sponsor, took medical leave. 2 other precinct leaders began purging texts, deleting old emails, thinking they could outrun the wave. But it was too late. The DOJ subpoenas had already landed. Phones were seized. Computers were imaged. Every keystroke was now a liability. Desai brought in federal forensic auditors to go beyond standard protocol. They reconstructed conversations from backups Slater thought he'd erased, traced encrypted messages sent through burner apps, and most damning, found video footage stored on a private server inside Delta Shield Solutions' office suite. In one grainy clip, Dominion officers in civilian clothing sit around a table reviewing a list of names black officers and recruits flagged for removal. Maya recognized two of them. One was Thomas Chen, Noel's brother, the other herself. The footage was time-stamped 2 weeks before her appointment. They had known, planned, waited. She sat in silence after viewing it, hands clasped. Then she looked up at Noel, who stood pale, trembling. "Start building a witness protection list," Maya said. "Every name on that video. We're going to keep them alive this time, publicly." The narrative was spiraling. News networks debated whether Maya would survive politically. Protesters gathered outside City Hall holding signs that read, "Clean house. Start here and from chief to target." But inside the walls of the NOPD, a deeper current flowed. Officers who had once worn smirks now avoided eye contact. Old jokes about chain of command fell silent. Rumors of a federal takeover hung thick in the air like humidity before a storm. Maya was discharged on day 5. She didn't go home. She went to work. At the next press briefing, she stood behind a bank of microphones. Her uniform pressed, her voice steady. "I will not be pressing individual charges," she said, "because this is not about one assault or one officer. This is about a culture of sanctioned erasure, and I intend to dismantle it not with revenge, but with the full weight of accountability." The next 48 hours were seismic. 4 more officers confessed under federal immunity agreements. 1 Dominion member, Sergeant Leon Briggs, flipped, completely admitting to planting evidence in at least 6 arrests. "They told us it was war," Briggs said. "Us versus chaos. We didn't realize we were the chaos." Desai held his own press conference, announcing the expansion of the investigation to include judicial partners and private contractors. Gibbons's chambers were raided. Delta Shield's offices seized. Financial records began to unravel the flow of corruption like a tangled spool. City contracts, quiet bonuses, campaign donations, all circling back to Dominion sponsors. Meanwhile, Maya reopened her father's file. This time, it didn't vanish. This time, it was Exhibit A. The winds of New Orleans had shifted. The storm wasn't in the sky, but in the record's forgotten files stirring like restless spirits from the past. In her first act, upon returning to her office, Chief Maya Roux signed a sweeping executive order known internally as the Bayou Protocol, a name borrowed from her father's phrase for rooting out corruption. Drain it like the swamp it is. This wasn't just an audit. This was a resurrection. Maya ordered a forensic re-examination of every misconduct complaint, every internal affairs resolution, every closed-door arbitration from the last 25 years. She gave her task force unfettered access, pulled redacted files out of digital shadows, and defied every tradition of selective accountability that had made the department a fortress of deniability. The ripple turned into a wave within hours. The first major crack came from the basement of the NOPD archive building, a rust-stained room where paper files sat untouched since the late 90s. Inside, a technician stumbled across a mislabeled box marked Juvenile Infractions, 1991. What they found instead were surveillance transcripts from the French Quarter protest, where Maya's father, Isaiah Roux, had been arrested and branded a threat to public order. But the transcripts revealed something else. Isaiah had never raised his voice, never resisted, never carried the Molotov cocktail they claimed. In fact, the report was falsified. One officer's signature, Sergeant Derek Slater, appeared twice, once under the field report, and again in a supplemental memo calling Isaiah an instigator of high threat potential. The file also included a photo, young Maya, age 9, clinging to her father's leg as officers pulled him away in front of the cathedral. Maya stared at the image for a long time. This wasn't just corruption. This was a legacy. As the Bayou Protocol widened, the walls of silence began to fall. Internal affairs officers, long shielded from scrutiny, found themselves under review. Agent Desai's team uncovered a pattern. More than 60 misconduct cases were closed in under a week between 2005 and 2018, all dismissed with identical language, unsubstantiated, witness not credible. But the audit revealed those witnesses were primarily black civilians, many with ties to community leadership or reform advocacy. More disturbing still, several IA investigators had received unexplained deposits in their private accounts, money that, after forensic tracing, was linked to shell companies under Delta Shield Solutions. What looked like bonuses were bribes. What looked like incompetence was orchestration. Maya convened an emergency summit inside City Hall's press briefing chamber. Flanked by Desai, Noel Chen, and 3 community leaders, she announced the initial findings. "What we are uncovering," she said, "isn't about a few bad actors. It's about an entire mechanism designed to break down trust and rebuild it in the image of fear." Her voice, though calm, carried steel beneath the surface. Delta Shield isn't a vendor, it's a parasite. And its roots run through this department, this city, and even the courtrooms we once called impartial. The fallout was immediate. Judge Harland Givens, who had once presided with smug finality over misconduct appeals, was indicted on federal corruption charges. The press swarmed his home. Cameras caught him being led away in cuffs. The same silver bracelets he had so often sanctioned for others. Investigators found communications between Givens and Delta Shield executives coordinating judicial outcomes favorable to law enforcement integrity. Translation: they fixed trials, squashed reform, sacrificed truth for appearance. As Givens fell, so did others. 4 senior officers resigned in disgrace. Their emails traced to Dominion-planned media containment strategies and intimidation campaigns against whistleblowers. Captain Morris Denton, long considered untouchable, was caught shredding documents at midnight. His resignation came with a cryptic statement: "The system we protected no longer protects us." Another Dominion loyalist, Lieutenant Craig Foreman, attempted to flee the state before Desai's agents caught him at a Baton Rouge bus terminal. But the most dramatic moment came not in a courtroom, but on live television. On a Wednesday evening broadcast across Louisiana and streamed worldwide, Chief Maya Roux walked to the podium in the grand rotunda of City Hall, the flags behind her rippling under the soft roar of summer fans. She wore no dress uniform, no medals, just a charcoal blazer and a lapel pin shaped like a crescent moon, the emblem of her old 7th Ward neighborhood. The cameras snapped, the lights beamed, but her face remained composed. "This," she began, "isn't about one courtroom. It's about who we've let sit behind the bench. It's about the names we trusted to write justice while they were rewriting the rules." The room held its breath. For decades, New Orleans built a policing culture around the idea that order came before truth, that stability came before accountability, that loyalty came before conscience. But what we've discovered through the Bayou Protocol is not a broken system. It's a system working exactly as it was designed to protect power at all costs. The Dominion did not vanish. It rebranded. It privatized. It spread through security firms, campaign donations, and judicial appointments like a slow-moving infection. Her voice sharpened. It used fear as a leash, silence as a weapon, and procedure as a disguise. She placed a folder on the podium and opened it. Inside were photos, names, badge numbers, and time-stamped memos. The evidence. This is just the beginning. She turned the page. The arrest of my father in 1991 was not a mistake. It was a message. But here's the new message: this city belongs to all its people. And I will not rest until every mechanism of corruption is pulled out, root and bone, and laid bare in the light. The press didn't applaud. They didn't need to, because outside, across the wide plaza of Jackson Square, hundreds of people had gathered, silent but standing, holding candles, holding hands, holding signs that read, "Truth lives here now." The next day, the governor's office announced a special legislative session to introduce police transparency bills modeled after the Bayou findings. Delta Shield Solutions lost all active municipal contracts across 3 parishes. Federal investigations expanded to include other jurisdictions using similar vendors. Officers from the past decade began contacting the DOJ, offering testimony, data, and confession in exchange for immunity. Back at NOPD, Maya walked the halls not as a feared reformer, but as a weathered compass. Younger officers saluted with purpose. Veterans who once scoffed now stood straighter. One even whispered to her, "I almost left last year. You gave me a reason to stay." In the basement, Noelle Chen completed Mosaic's final layer, a digital map now encompassing over 300 incidents connected to Dominion Network's falsified charges, suppressed evidence, sabotaged careers. The DOJ planned to release the database publicly under a new federal transparency initiative. Maya stood over Noelle's shoulder as the last file was uploaded. "No one hides behind the badge anymore," she said. "From now on, the badge stands behind them." That night, Maya returned to her apartment for the first time in days. She opened a bottle of red wine her mother had saved for something worth remembering. She stood by the window, glass in hand, watching the streetlights cast quiet halos on the cobblestones below. She thought of her father, his hands, calloused and strong, the way he used to tuck her in at night and whisper, "One day, baby girl, you're gonna sit in the room where decisions get made." She thought of Isaiah's last court date, how the charges were dropped, but the stain remained, how people whispered his name like a cautionary tale, how he died waiting for an apology that never came. And now, Maya stood in that room. She made the decisions. And the apology wasn't spoken. It was written in ink, in law, in consequence. The system hadn't fallen. It was being rebuilt. The first real thunderstorm of August broke over New Orleans, as if summoned by the tides of change. Rain streaked down the courthouse windows like a cleansing ritual, washing months of silence from the city's concrete bones. Inside a federal building overlooking the Mississippi River, Chief Maya Roux stood beneath an American flag, a slim dossier in one hand, her other pressed flat against the podium. The words she spoke were not just to the cameras broadcasting live across the country, but to the system that had once swallowed her father's dignity, tried to strip hers, and now trembled beneath the weight of its own reflection. We can no longer afford selective justice. she said, her voice even but sharp. What we do in New Orleans cannot stay in New Orleans. If truth is local, then reform must be national. The next morning, headlines erupted, Bayou Protocol goes federal. Within 72 hours, the U.S. Department of Justice announced the formation of a multi-agency federal task force to investigate systemic misconduct across southern precincts. It bore a simple, uncompromising name, the Roux Commission, led by Special Agent Arjun Desai and staffed with civil rights attorneys, data analysts, and retired military investigators. The commission's scope expanded beyond Louisiana into Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and even parts of Texas. What began as a local audit had turned into a regional reckoning. But that wave didn't break by itself. In Atlanta, where whispers of a parallel group called the Sentinel Cohort had circulated for years, Maya's reforms lit a fuse. Officers previously silenced by retaliation came forward, citing Roux' televised speech as their reason. In Birmingham, a retired black detective released a handwritten ledger, notes from internal cases he'd never been allowed to investigate, naming 5 officials still in office. Maya Roux gave us language for what we've felt for decades, he told the press. She didn't just call out the darkness, she made it visible. In Jackson, Mississippi, a rookie cop named Elijah Dorsey uploaded a video confession detailing racial profiling orders he'd received as part of training simulations. That video ended with a simple declaration, if she can stand in that storm, so can I. The ripple became a current. The current became a tide. And Congress took notice. By late September, a bipartisan group of legislators introduced the Roux Civil Accountability Act, a sweeping federal bill designed to protect officers who report internal abuse and restrict law enforcement from engaging with unregulated private contractors like Delta Shield. Among its provisions were 1, mandatory transparency for all disciplinary records, 2, criminal liability for falsifying case outcomes, and 3, a national ban on shadow contracting firms without federal oversight. At the Capitol press conference, a Republican senator from Georgia surprised even his own base when he quoted Maya directly, "Power without conscience is just another form of cowardice." Meanwhile, in New Orleans, the trial of Derek Slater commenced. It was a somber affair, quiet, clinical, but dense with symbolism. The man once feared for his grip now sat behind reinforced glass, his hands cuffed, his hair graying under courtroom lights that had once reflected off his badge. The charges were extensive civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, assault of a public official, and perjury under oath. But it wasn't just what he did to Maya in that courtroom that led him here. It was everything before the pattern of abuse. The orchestrated detentions, the destruction of careers, the falsified reports brought into the light like bones unearthed from marshland. The prosecution began with testimony from Darius Maddox, the young EMT whose wrongful beating first brought Maya to courtroom 3B. Darius stood with his jaw still wired, his voice muffled but fierce. He looked at me like I wasn't human. He told the jury, like my uniform didn't mean anything, like my life didn't mean anything. Then came Officer Chen, who presented the Dominion's internal communications, then Noel Chen, who decoded the file logs, and finally, Maya herself. Her testimony lasted 5 hours. In it, she did not speak of pain, she spoke of design. "I was not assaulted by mistake," she said, looking directly at Slater. "I was assaulted because that courtroom was built on assumptions that black women don't belong in front rows unless they are defendants." and because the system trained men like him to see resistance in our silence. The courtroom was silent after she stepped down. Even the defense struggled to mount a counter-narrative. When the verdict was read guilty on all counts, there was no cheer, only a release, like a slow exhale across generations. But Maya knew one conviction wasn't justice. It was only proof that justice was possible. The real work happened in the months that followed. Roux and Dacier's teams worked to implement the Unified Transparency Standard, which allowed citizens to access audit trails on departmental decisions. IA divisions were required to house an independent civilian panel in each major city. Officers wrongfully terminated under Dominion-style tactics were offered reinstatement reviews. Civilian victims of false arrests began receiving settlement packages. Most chose to donate part of those funds to the Justice for All initiative, a nonprofit Maya launched to train young activists and fund legal support for whistleblowers. Even Hollywood took notice. A documentary titled Bayou Protocol, The Woman Who Turned the Badge, began filming, with Maya reluctantly granting access to selected interviews. She made one condition: the film could not tell her story until it told everyone's. The survivors, the silenced, the staffers who defied orders, the officers who chose principle over comfort, the techs who found the files no one wanted found. Back in New Orleans, the city that once recoiled from its own reflection began to rewrite its image. Maya walked through the 7th Ward with a different energy now. Elders nodded from porches. Youths saluted. Even critics who once scoffed had softened. And yet she remained the same, deliberate, grounded, ever watchful. One evening in October, she returned to the church where her father's funeral had been held. She stood alone in the nave, a folder in hand. Inside was her father's expunged record, sealed by the very system that once condemned him. She placed it beneath the altar and whispered, "You were right, Daddy. I did make it to the room where decisions are made, and I made sure the door didn't close behind me." Outside, the church bells rang, not as an elegy, but an announcement. A city once haunted by silence was learning how to speak again. The morning air carried the weight of memory. A soft breeze swept through Basin Street, rustling the magnolia trees outside the newly renovated entrance of New Orleans Police Department headquarters. For decades, the building had stood as a symbol of authority, stoic, impenetrable, and, for many, unapproachable. But today, the morning sun reflected off fresh stone, etched not with titles or medals, but with names. Dozens of names. Each carved letter told a story of silence shattered, and at the center of it all stood Chief Maya Roux, flanked by survivors, officers, and citizens alike. Her uniform was crisp, but her posture told another story: reverence, resolve, and the kind of strength forged not in armor, but in truth. The new structure was called simply the Wall of Reckoning. Set into the outer plaza of NOPD HQ, the wall was made of black granite, smooth and polished to mirror-like precision. Visitors approaching it would first see their own reflections, a symbolic reminder that the pursuit of justice was not an abstract mission, but a personal one. Then, as they stepped closer, the names revealed themselves: people harmed, silenced, wrongfully arrested, or buried by misconduct. The engraved lines shimmered under the Louisiana sun. It was not a wall of shame. It was a wall of remembrance, a living testament to what had been endured, survived, and ultimately exposed. Maya stood with a small plaque in hand. Her breath caught briefly, but she held steady. The crowd hushed as she knelt and placed the first name at the base of the memorial. Ernest Roux, her father, her first truth, a jazz musician, community organizer, and the man who had once knelt on these very steps in handcuffs during the 1991 protest that would change the course of her life. She remembered the bruises on his wrists, the silence of neighbors too scared to speak, and the courtroom where justice was denied by a shrug. But she also remembered his hands, gentle but firm, teaching her to play piano, to read law books, to question everything. "They can take everything but your name," he used to say, "so live like your name is all you've got." Behind her stood Elijah Dorsey, the rookie from Jackson, Noel Chen, Special Agent Desai, and across the plaza, framed by local media, were dozens of survivors from other cities: Atlanta, Birmingham, Miami, who had come not to watch, but to witness. Children held the hands of elders. Officers in dress blues stood shoulder to shoulder with civilians in T-shirts that read, "We are the record now." Maya rose slowly. She turned to face them. "This isn't closure," she began, her voice clear and steady. "This isn't an end. This wall doesn't finish a story, it starts a new one. One that won't be erased when administrations change or cameras disappear. One that lives in every officer who decides not to look away. In every citizen who demands that service mean protection, not silence." She paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd. Justice doesn't begin at the badge. It begins when the truth has nowhere left to hide. A quiet tremor moved through the audience. Not applause, something deeper, a hum of shared reckoning. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded letter, yellowed at the edges. It was her father's final note, written from the hospital bed where he died. She read it once more in silence, then placed it behind the glass of the memorial case beside his name. "You did it," she whispered. Then she turned, descending the steps slowly, her figure casting a long shadow over the plaza, across the city, and eventually the country. Other departments began constructing their own walls, not of defense, not of denial, but of memory. Because when history speaks, the righteous must answer. And Maya Roux had answered in full, in the story of Chief Maya Roux. We find more than a tale of one woman's resilience. We find a mirror held up to America's conscience. Her journey, from silent observer to reforming authority, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems we trust. The courtroom assault wasn't an isolated incident. It was the boiling point of generations of institutional denial, where a black woman in power was still seen, first and foremost, as a threat. But Maya didn't meet that violence with retaliation. She met it with strategy, with purpose, with truth, and in doing so, she exposed what too many have whispered, and too few have dared to say aloud, that silence is never neutral, that complicity is a choice, and that justice delayed isn't just justice denied, it is trauma prolonged. Her creation of the Bayou Protocol was not just policy, it was a blueprint for how truth can be recovered from beneath years of buried files and broken promises. And when the names of survivors were carved into stone outside NOPD headquarters, it wasn't just about remembrance. It was a declaration the days of hiding behind procedure, of shielding misconduct with bureaucracy, are over. We learn from Maya that real leadership doesn't come from controlling the narrative, but from cracking it open, from inviting light into the darkest corners of power, and in the faces of those who once suffered in silence, from the young EMT beaten for doing his job, to the officer whose brother was unjustly expelled. We see the cost of inaction. We see why truth matters. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: courage is not always loud. Sometimes it looks like a woman standing alone in a courtroom, not flinching as a gun is drawn. Sometimes it looks like opening a file that others buried, or signing an order that might end your career but restore someone else's dignity. Courage, as Maya showed us, is not a moment, it's a mission, a refusal to let injustice pass unchallenged, no matter the risk. She reminds us that true accountability doesn't begin with punishing the guilty. It begins with protecting the truth-tellers, the whistleblowers, the quiet observers ready to speak when no one else will. And this story, Maya's story, is not fiction. It's a composite of too many real ones. Every name on that memorial wall is an echo from our own cities, from our own courts, from our own neighborhoods. We've seen too many headlines where justice came too late, or never at all. But what Maya Roux teaches us is that it doesn't have to stay that way. That change isn't born in Washington. It starts in rooms like the one you're sitting in now. It begins when we decide that learning the truth is more important than protecting our illusions. It begins when we stop looking away. So here's what we ask of you, not just as viewers, but as citizens. Don't let this story stop here. Hit the like button if you believe justice should never depend on rank, race, or uniform. Subscribe to our channel if you want to see more stories that challenge power and lift up the unheard. Share this video with someone who still believes silence is safety. Because the truth is, silence is where injustice lives the longest. Let's build something lasting from this moment. A community that doesn't just consume stories of courage, but acts on them. Because Maya Roux may be a symbol, but the next chapter belongs to all of us. Now, ask yourself, what wall are you willing to build? Not to divide, but to remember. And what truth are you finally ready to uncover? This is more than content. This is a call. Stand with us. Stand with the truth.